Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. We've been following the U.S. invasion of Venezuela and all of the many oil-related stories behind it for the last couple of weeks. Today we're bringing you an interview that our new and amazing senior global climate justice reporter Nina Lakhani did with Fernanda Hohenheim, member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. What Hohenheim lays out here is that the Trump administration, in capturing various tankers and unilaterally taking over oil production in Venezuela, has violated multiple different international laws. And while President Trump might think that that doesn't matter or doesn't apply to him or the U.S., companies involved in the sale and trade of that oil are opening themselves up to a lot of legal liability. Hohenheim describes why and how in this very interesting conversation. That's coming up right after this quick break. You can also read a version of this story on our website at drilled.media.
I'm really interested in the different legal consequences and risks around the US military action in Venezuela. What legal exposure do the stated aims and what we're now seeing being put into action mean for the seizure of Venezuelan oil?
Well, the thing is, all of this intervention has been done unilaterally outside of, let's say, the international. So I think that whichever angle we're trying to look at it from, we end up concluding that this is, well, first of all, and this has been already stated, a blind violation of the UN Charter. And what we've seen in other countries that, for example, have sanctions is that this comes from the UN Security Council in a collective manner according to international architecture, which we can discuss and criticize, of course, but it is what we have nowadays. So this is totally outside of that scenario, that architecture, and that is what it makes it particularly concerning. And I would say it has some similarities with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in terms of a permanent member of the Security Council breaching the UN Charter. Different permanent members within 4 years have done illegal actions outside of the Charter. But here, it's been at the same time very different in terms of going in, taking the president, which, again, we can discuss the legality or illegality of those elections and all of that in Venezuela, but taking a head of state and under arguments that are not related to anything connected to democracy, to human rights, and everything we're questioning about Venezuela and monitoring in Venezuela. The argument is narco trafficking, and that is highly concerning in Mexico, Colombia, any other country where, they could potentially use that argument to intervene in the country. So all the legality, I would say, of his actions is really questionable. And now the extraction of oil and supposedly the sale of oil is really something that it's being done in a total void of a legal framework. So the companies need to consider, because they can be complicit to this illegal actions.
Can we think about this oil in sort of two parts? First of all, the seized tankers, right? So then we have the question of these sanctions, whether these sanctions, these unilateral sanctions and the violations of these sanctions, the legality of all of that. What I'm doing right now with some research colleagues is that we're tracking the oil that has been seized from the tankers and where that is going. So we've been able so far to look at all of the different corporations that have somehow been linked to this oil. So from the commodity traders to the refineries, to those specialist companies. I think there's about 35 companies that have somehow been named so far, either by the Trump, his administration, or in press reports or whatever, right? And what we can see so far is that several of the tankers have been bought by or in the hands of one or two of the big commodity traders and are en route to the refineries in Louisiana. But when we look at this oil that was seized under this pretense of the sanctions, what would you say in terms of sort of potential corporate and business sort of liability and complicity in this? What are the rules, the norms, the laws that corporations could be at risk of violating if they engage in the selling and the trading and the buying of this oil and these refined products?
Yeah. So if we look at this framework that we have, UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is the standard that we've had for 15 years, that kind of provides a lot of clarity in terms of state obligations, the existing ones, it doesn't create new ones, corporate responsibility, and then access to remedy when things happen, violations happen. But this framework, in terms of the responsibility of corporations, really establishes 3 ways in which companies can, let's say, be involved in human rights abuses or illegal actions with regards to this. So they can be causing them directly in their operations. They can be connected to them directly by their commercial relationships, or let's say their providers, their supply chain, etc. So they have a responsibility over their supply chain, but they can also be linked to them by engaging in certain business outside of a legal framework, let's say, or connected to human rights violations. And even outside of their supply chain. I think that's the distinction between number 2 and number 3, right? One is your own operation, the second, your supply chain, the third, any link, commercial link to something that's violating international law. Say, which would be the case here. So for companies that want to get contracts with the US government to refine that or to export that or to be part of the operation, I think that's the risk, that they're linked to flagrant violation of international.
Right. Because I think these companies, the way they're going to justify it is that, well, we're buying off the US government. But to me, it seems really obvious that you can't just take someone's oil. Whether you're the most powerful country in the world, the law is the law, right? Just because you say it's fine doesn't make it fine, right? It doesn't make it legal. And so is it a false reassurance they're giving themselves that they have no case to answer here legally just because the US has said that they now own the oil or they're now in charge of the oil?
I mean, I think they're probably navigating a gray area, right? Where I think the world hasn't been able to react. This kind of shocking, I would say, storm of illegality, if you will. And they're just saying, we're going to profit from this gray area. Well, I think there's a legal problem. There's an ethical problem in this. I mean, it's probably juicy in terms of business, so they're going to do it. Many of these companies, I would say most probably, I haven't seen the whole list, are based in the US or are incorporated in the US. Most of them probably, which gives them a legal protection of their own states. If we were thinking about, let's say, a French company or a British company or some companies coming from different home states, at least the headquarters, the parent company, I think we could use that with those governments and say, you should be sanctioning, giving warnings to these companies, to your companies from your country, because they are going to be complicit in violations of international law. But one, I would say, of the problems is that many of these companies are US based. And so they kind of have the protection of the US government, if you will. So they are all acting in this gray area together.
Yeah, a lot of the companies are European, actually. So, for example, the main trader is Vitol, and Vitol is a Dutch company. Also, the companies at the refined products end, most of the companies that are looking to get involved or at least showing signs they're ready to get back involved are companies that were previously operating in Venezuela. And in Europe, when it comes to the refined final product destination, it seems to be mostly the Mediterranean companies. So Spanish oil company, Eni in Italy, because of the type of oil and the type of refined product you're getting. So actually, I mean, yes, there's the refineries in the US, and obviously Chevron and Exxon are US companies. But there is a whole load in between that I think are going to be European and outside of Europe as well.
Well, there, I think we can you definitely look at the legal frameworks in Europe as well. For example, we've worked for a long time with this community of practice of business and human rights on the CSDDD, so the directive
Yeah.
on human rights and environmental due diligence that was now diluted into the omnibus law. But even in the omnibus package, the big companies, which I'm sure these oil companies fall into
Yes.
that category, of course, in terms of profit and number of employees and number of
Yes.
subsidiaries, etc. There is that framework that can be used to hold these companies accountable. Because these companies should, according to this European frameworks, not get involved in this. They should conduct due diligence to make sure they're not complicit with human rights or environmental abuses.
Yeah.
So here we have, of course, everything you've already explored on the environment, climate, and all of that. So they would be, let's say, potentially in violation of those provisions. But then we're also talking about international law and human rights law also in Venezuela. So applying to Venezuela and to everything that happens. Also, all this seizing of tankers are done in international waters. There are a lot of elements of illegality in the way they're being done. The U.S. government, I've read, always has stated in these 3 occasions that it has been done with no hiccups, when saying, no problems. But what we don't know, the use of arms with the crew, for example, et cetera, et cetera. Are they seizing the people? What are they doing with those persons? You know, sometimes they are illegally detained. They could be tortured. There are a lot of rights layers that once one starts to look at that, these companies should include all those things in their due diligence. So if start complying with the frameworks in their countries or the European frameworks, because also, you know, Spain has its own provisions, France, the Netherlands, etc. They're probably in breach, to say the least, if they get involved in this.
I mean, yes, there's this promise of juicy profits, right, with the protection of the Trump administration. But under international law and also domestic laws, by what you're saying, is that it doesn't recuse any of these companies from undertaking the due diligence that it's required to undertake. That would not be a defense in court.
It wouldn't, and I foresee a lot of cases coming to courts in the coming years. Because, well, the problem is when you violate the law, that it only takes you so far. And you can't withstand that case for years. So I think many of these companies, probably particularly European companies, could be taken to court by different organizations and institutions, plaintiffs, even from Venezuela or outside Venezuela. Because this, again, the way this exploitation of oil is being done goes against everything the international courts are saying, for example. So.
And with the US companies, I guess one point to ask you, well, there's a 2-part question. One is that the refineries, so we have the US incorporated oil companies, right? And we have the US refineries. Now, specifically, the harms that will be done to the population around those refineries are well known, are foreseeable, are predictable. And that is something that the International Court of Justice was very clear about in its ruling, right? These are foreseeable harms, right? So just to, even though these are US-based corporations, potentially could people who are harmed in the US, as well as in Venezuela, from the production and the processing of the oil in the US, could they potentially look at the international courts to bring cases? Even if in the US, it would be more difficult.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the case. You know, they could use the American system.
Yeah.
The US is in the Americas, after all. They could use, of course, the international system, right? The universal system, and bring complaints to the different UN mechanisms or bring legal cases to the courts. I also see that there are many of these issues that are so linked to environmental and climate elements that these are, let's say, of international interest.
Yeah.
So I've seen in some cases the argument that any parts could bring a complaint to an international court if there is a group of companies contributing to worsening the climate emergency, for example. This is kind of something that broadens, if you will, the legitimate interest of the plaintiff. It's not just that it happened in my neighborhood or my house or in my community. It's something that is harming the climate system. So anyone potentially could argue that legitimate interest in putting forward a formal complaint, a legal case,
Yes.
in suing the country or the companies. So I think that really can increase liability.
And I was also wondering just about in terms of state obligations here, because again, the ICJ advisory opinion was very clear that states are responsible for regulating the corporations that are within their sort of jurisdictions, for licenses, for production, for all of their foreseeable harms. So if Spain or the Netherlands, for example, corporations from their countries are then engaged in the buying and selling of this oil and oil refined products, potentially, my question is whether the states themselves could at least face questions about their failure to regulate the companies in this particular case.
I think that's definitely the case. I mean, who's going to produce the different products? Who's going to sell it? Who's going to buy it? If any given country also buys it, you're complicit from start point to end point. And I think that needs to be crystal clear for companies and for states. And then I think that many experts in the field, NGOs, academics, etc., have quite a bit of clarity on this. And they're going to potentially, as they've done in other cases, suing states for not regulating the gun production, for example, the arms trades. In the case of Gaza, we have a few examples.
Yes.
I think this is something that could happen in this case as well. In any given country, but particularly those that have stronger regulations and are not even complying with those themselves as a regulator in their monitoring, let's say, and enforcing roles, but also the companies that are not complying.
I think the Netherlands is really interesting. Last year, I worked with some non-profit researchers and we tracked the companies in the countries that was continuing to sell oil to Israel since the genocide ruling, right? And so we've been keeping a track of those. And now we're sort of digging deeper into one of the commodity traders who is also involved in the crude going to Israel, but also involved in the Venezuelan case. And last week, there was a very interesting and important sentence in the Netherlands regarding the state's failure around climate change and its policies around climate action. So I think that's really interesting where that could go, both from a corporate and state angle. The other sort of part of this, I guess, is the oil that the US is now saying it's in control over, that's still in the ground in Venezuela. And you've touched on this already, the illegality of the removal of a head of state under false pretenses, and an open invitation for companies, especially American companies, but others too, to go and start extracting and exploiting this oil. When I've asked attorneys about this, the question that they keep bringing up, saying it makes it very grey, is the cooperation between the Venezuelan government. I mean, under duress, it's very, very arguable that is happening. But I just wonder how you see that in terms of corporate accountability and responsibility of the US basically unilaterally again saying, not just that we want you to come in, but we're going to manage the money. We're going to manage the buying and the selling and the profits, all of that. Like, where is the corporate responsibility and accountability there?
Well, the thing is, if we look at the news, it seems like the US is in control and just making all these decisions. And if we listen to Trump, that's how it's put right out there. We're doing this. With cooperation of this kind of middle government, we are in control of this. Strictly speaking, the current president, then whomever comes afterwards, if they end up having participated in elections, which they call for, then they retreat. Well, I don't know what they are going to do about it. At this moment in time, this is the government in Venezuela. This is the ruling force, if you will. So a company could just say, I have a contract with the Venezuelan government, for example. And even though Dempsey Rodriguez reached the government by this illegal action by the US, et cetera, it's not that Maduro died of a heart attack. But I think legally speaking, strictly speaking, this could potentially be seen as legal if the contract is not with the US government or anything. So if the contracts are legally framed with the Venezuelan government as, a concession for the extraction of oil, then any company could argue this is a legal contract. The problem is how these things happened, how it got there. And that's why we I think what we're trying to do at the working group and different mechanisms is just to kind of put a red flag. Like, it might be legally framed domestically in Venezuela, but if you're an international actor and all these breaches of international law have happened, you can be complicit nevertheless. So it's not just about the legality of the contract, it's broader. That's the message we're trying to put there, is that one shouldn't just be looking at how that concession was given and how the contract is written according to Venezuelan law, but just look at it from a broader framework that talks about, again, the guiding principle that state very clearly the responsibilities of companies, international law, the international court's advisory opinions, etc.
It's interesting because you're saying that as international actors, they have these international responsibilities. You can't be an international actor without having international responsibilities. And I wonder also, when you talked earlier about the 3 ways human rights abuses can occur, if we think about where the oil is in Venezuela, in areas that are very controlled by the military or paramilitary group, the potential for violations in terms of human rights violations and environmental violations, all of those are very high, right? And so those are things that it sounds like when you're putting the red flag up, you're also sort of warning companies about, right? Just because the contract might look legal, all of these other responsibilities they still have.
Oh, yeah, they definitely stand. And even in countries where, I'd say, human rights or environmental due diligence is not mandatory, they still need to do it because they have this international responsibility. So Venezuela doesn't require any of those. But if they have the contract, they have the concession, and they just come in, extract, and do their own thing, that's still a legal liability for them in terms of international. They don't conduct due diligence, understand the human rights risks, prevent them. Also in these areas, for the, I would say, extractive industries in general, there is always, of course, a big environmental risk, but also communities. Then you need to engage with their indigenous communities. They are protected by international law. They are peoples of special protection, and they are entitled to consent. So there are a lot of elements there that it's not just the legality of contracts, which is something that even companies struggle with then. If you talk to any company representative from the sustainability or even human rights in some cases department, they would say that they have an internal fight with the legal department because legal is about complying with the regulations.
Yeah.
Their minimum, just comply, then you're okay. And the other, no, we need to comply with all these other responsibilities that we have.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about Nigeria being a very good example, right? Where actually all these companies, you're now seeing litigation in the UK and in France and so forth, right? Companies that had contracts, but the forced eviction of communities, the violence and the social conflict generated by the security forces, a whole range of violations, the same in many mining communities in Africa. These are all legal obligations that require due diligence. And all of these companies, Chevron, Exxon, cannot be protected fully by the US's, self-declared impunity from everything.
That's, I think, another important message is, even if you have a legal contract with the current Venezuelan, let's say, government, quote unquote, then, you should still be responsible in terms of how you conduct your operations. First of all, I would warn, don't go to Venezuela now, because again, the illegal action by the US has put the country in a position where there is a legal void. And the way, again, these tankers have been seized, etc., but also the way the oil still hasn't been extracted can put you in a situation where you're complicit with violations of international law. And I would argue, if I were a business person, that I wouldn't want to be connected to violations of international law. So that's, I think, the warning we need to clearly give to companies. First, you don't want to be complicit with violations of international law or connected to violations of international law in a very unstable, illegal situation in Venezuela. Second, you don't want to be causing or connected to human rights violations on the ground in Venezuela when you're trying to extract that oil. And you need to conduct due diligence. So those messages, I think, are the ones that we're trying to put out there to companies, and just to say, you really need to be careful here. It's not just a business opportunity, and it's not about the welfare of Venezuelans. Everybody knows that.
No.
You're not going to, maybe you pay some taxes, the situation of the Venezuelans is as terrible as it was before they took to the US, and nobody cares. That's the other thing. Like, all of this are being seen as business opportunities. They can try. It's about the development of Venezuela and the well-being of Venezuelans, but so far we haven't seen.
I mean, any discussion of the rule of law, security has really only been said in the context of making it a place to do business. But that's the motivation. Just to follow on from your sort of warnings, would you also say that states themselves cannot wash their hands of the way that the corporations that go in, if the corporations that do go in and do benefit from the illegal actions that have taken place, that states themselves will also bear a responsibility for that, will they not?
Certainly. I would add that to the list of warnings, for sure, because many of these companies, again, coming from these countries that actually are mandated to be transparent and with due diligence to make sure that their operations are done with integrity. There are many rules in many of these countries, and we have the European rules, but then again, the Netherlands has its own.
Yeah.
France, Spain,
Yeah.
many in different areas. Many are more focused on environmental issues. Some other are human rights, on transparency, anti-corruption, integrity, many things that are now at risk in Venezuela.
Yeah.
So if those companies coming from those countries are going to operate there, as the same analogy with Nigeria, Shell was, sued in the Netherlands, not in Nigeria. And then, one could argue that the Dutch government can also be sued for regulating adequately their own.
Yeah. And on top of all of that now, we have the ICJ-AO that says you as a state, especially the high polluting states, have a responsibility, international legal responsibility to regulate companies so they do not do foreseeable climate harms, right? I mean, that's on top of all of the things that you just mentioned, right? So you said this earlier, but it feels like there's going to be lots of litigation happening in the context of this Venezuelan oil grab.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I know it's incomparable, but I have a similar feeling of what happened in Gaza. The genocide is this feeling that nobody could stop it, that we could do a lot of actions outside, which is what many actors have done.
Yeah.
Suing states, suing companies, looking for solutions outside of the territory because there it seemed like that nothing could be done to stop it. I think that something like the strategies seems to be similar, I guess. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of litigation outside of Venezuela and outside the US, in international courts and in other states.
Yeah. This has been so helpful, Fernanda. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for this time. We'll be back soon with another episode. Don't forget to check out our website at drilled.media. Our theme music is Bird in the Hand by Forknown. Our artwork is by Matthew Fleming. You can also check us out on social media at Drilled Media. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website as well. That comes out once a week and gives an overview of an important story that's happening in the climate universe, plus suggestions for the week's 5 must-read climate stories. It's never more than a 10-minute read, and people tell us it helps them keep up to date on all things climate.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number, 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number, save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.